Okay, another issue with this race as biology conception is that just as the idea of race varies culturally, within the US, it's also varied historically. So our understanding of race is different from previous understandings of race. And likely in the future, we might have different understandings then as well. So this might be something that you've heard about or are familiar with, but there was a time when being white did not include people that were Jewish, Irish, and Italians. They were not considered to be white. It was only folks of like Anglo-Saxon descent. But over time, those groups have been included in this category of whiteness. And in some ways, like being Irish, I think has become almost like a quintessential white grouping that we very much identify being Irish with being white. But that is a relatively recent understanding. Back in the 1920s and 30s, the situation was quite different. And we can see these historical variations in different US census. So in 1800, the categories you could choose from were free white men and women, slaves, and everyone else except Indians or Native Americans. 80 years later, it was people who were white, black, mixed race, American Indian, Chinese, and Japanese. And in 1950, whites, black, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and other. Today, and you may have had experience of seeing this with the recent US Census. If not, you'll probably get it 10 years from now when we do the next one. But today, you could actually choose your own race, and there are more categories available, but then there is also other, and other is which is could be again something that's not represented on here or a combination of different races. That is the fastest growing demographic group in the US, which is the other, someone that doesn't fall neatly within these categories. But we can see now that you have white, black, African American, American Indian, or Alaskan Native. You can indicate which tribe you are, Asian Indian, Chinese, Filipino, other Asian, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Native Hawaiian, Guatemanian, Samoan, other Pacific Islander, or down here, you could define your race in other terms in the ways that you think more accurately represents your particular circumstance. And one thing that's interesting to think about are conceptions of race, and at least how we define race in the US, is which racial category would someone pick if they're from Iran, Armenia, or Syria? All right. Which of these categories would best reflect this? And now that there is other, you could potentially put it down here. But if this was excluded, where would we classify these people in terms of their racial category? And the answer is technically white. Right? The folks from Iran, Armenia, Syria, Iraq are defined as being white within our general racial categories. But it's interesting because I think so officially white, but I think on our intuitive scale, we would not think of these folks as being white. We might think of it as being Middle Eastern, but Middle Eastern is more a geographic reference and not a racial category. And this just shows that, again, the official way we define race may not always align with how people use race in the everyday world or think in terms of race in the everyday world. All right, so today you can choose your own race. And then you can also choose your ethnicity. And specifically, are you Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? Right? And so you could be white Hispanic, white non-Hispanic, black Hispanic, black non-Hispanic, and you can see the different categories here, and also some other ones that you can write down there. All right, and then the final point I want to make is we can see that this race as biology conception has a lot of trouble accounting for the things it says it's going to account for and explaining the things it says it can explain or make sense of. So it's a very problematic concept and is one that I think is quite inaccurate. And it can be tempting to think, well, this doesn't count for much of the world, so therefore race shouldn't really matter, right? If our category of race is problematic, then it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't have any effect in the real world. But we know that's not true because of the Thomas theorem, in the sense that if people treat race as a real category and operate on the basis of this category, even though this category isn't true, then it's real in its consequence. So race, again, this conception of race as biology is really problematic. I don't think it really does a good job accounting for the world. So as a scientific concept, it's very bad. But nevertheless, if people operate on the basis of it, they treat it as being real. It's real in its consequence. And exploring this issue of the consequences of race is what we'll do in our final lecture when we are in class. And we'll talk about this in the context of the legal system.